Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's that time again already. Today's subject is the latest University of Texas Politics Project poll. And this time we released this in two steps. So we released the data from a few items that we did related to the situation of suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton. It just seemed like we had a historic occasion happening in the Texas Senate as the Senate was considering rules. Now, you know, it's a great exercise in planning that we released the data early on Tuesday when the Senate was slated to review and theoretically pass the rules. Well, if you're listening to this, you probably know that it took the Senate a little bit longer than planned to do that. So that actually didn't happen till Wednesday night. We're recording here Thursday morning. Nonetheless, we released that batch of results on Tuesday early in the day. And then released everything else this morning, again on Thursday as we record this. So to do this, as is generally the case, happy to be joined by my colleagues on the UT Texas Politics Project polling team. We don't have jerseys or anything.
Oh.
Maybe we should.
It's hard to get those approved here.
It is. You got to go through a lot of paperwork unless we just bootleg the deal.
Yeah, we could do that separately. We can't.
So, joined by Daron, professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. I know you've been out of town and been busy, Daron, and teaching.
Yes, that's right.
You're very committed active, so thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Just got back from a conference in D.C. on response rates in polling, which we could also have a very fascinating 5-hour podcast on.
My pulse is racing, as I'm sure many of our listeners. And Joshua Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project.
My pulse is actually racing.
Well,
I would have that.
There you go. That captures it.
Yeah.
Who has been in town, unfortunately missed the MLS game last night for weather purposes, right?
It's too late. The Austin FC game was, this heat dome, all this water, the lightning, and then it was like, kickoff is going to be at like 10:15, and I said, nope.
Yeah,
that's not for me.
That's right in the range of bedtime. Yes,
it's about a minute from bedtime.
Okay, that's what I thought. So now that's why I texted Josh last night, going kind of incredulously. I saw on Twitter how late it was going. Like, are you at the game? Are you at the match?
And
I was just proud of myself for saying match.
That's pretty good.
Right.
Yeah,
is it still 0-0?
That's excellent for me. Is what that's beyond good.
Because every game is a novella on the pitch.
This is good. We're starting the soccer podcast now.
That's right.
Yes, there you go.
I've been waiting for this.
Hi.
Actually, novella on the
Ted
pitch
Lasso,
is a good.
Like
novella on the pitch is a good name for the podcast, actually. But yeah,
it's I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good name for soccer. All right, I'm going to stop now. So let's start with some of the results from the poll that touch on what's currently in the news that I've already kind of flagged. The Texas Senate yesterday released, after extensive deliberation behind the scenes, released its rules and the schedule for the trial of Ken Paxton. This version of the poll entered the field just after Paxton's impeachment by the Texas House. And we measured job approval, attention to the AG's legal problems and to the impeachment, and then views of the impeachment itself. Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we found?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest sort of top-line result that people are certainly to be most interested in was, we asked people whether they thought that the Texas House of Representatives was justified in its impeachment of Ken Paxton. 50% of voters said that they thought the House was justified. 17% said it was not, and a third, so 33%, held no opinion over this, which is not surprising. This, had just happened. And also, just to be very clear, we don't expect everybody to be paying a ton of attention to this, even though it is a big piece of news. Overall, Democrats were obviously lopsided in their support of impeachment. Nearly 3/4 thought the House was justified. But really, I think, maybe most interesting in this set of results was how divided Republicans were over this. So about equal shares, 31% said that, the House was justified in impeaching Paxton. 30% said that it was not. And I think really importantly, when we come back to this, 39% of the plurality had no opinion or were unwilling to offer up an opinion yet. But looking a little more broadly, a couple other just points from this set, we've been asking for a long time about whether people have been paying attention to Ken Paxton's legal problems. And for the most part, the people who have been paying the most attention have been Democrats. That's shifted a little bit. Now there are, more Republicans are paying more attention. And about 3/4 of voters say they've heard either a lot or something about, his legal problems generally and the impeachment in particular. I think most notably because we did poll just before the impeachment and now just after, we get a nice little snapshot here. And Paxton's job approval ratings did decline since polling that we conducted in April before the impeachment. So in April, Paxton had 39% of voters approving of his job performance, and disapproval was 35, so net +4. Now 30% approve, 41% disapprove, so net becomes -11. And and most importantly, his job. Most importantly, actually, to pull out of this, his job approval among Democrats did not change because Democrats already did not have positive views of Ken Paxton. Where his job approval did change was among Republicans. So between April and June, it went from 65% approving among Republicans and 13% disapproving to 51% approving, so a 14-point drop, and 19% disapproving. So he went from a net of +52 among Republicans to +32, and that's where I think, if you're Ken Paxton and his people, the alarm bells might be sounding a little bit, although there is some support in there, only because one of the arguments I think we've made a lot is about Ken Paxton and his staying ability, and the fact this has been going on so long is you say, well, yeah, but he's really popular among Republicans.
Yeah. Daron, what did you make of this?
Well, Josh laid out all the numbers, and I was looking at the approved, disapproved numbers, and I think the nature of the drop is interesting. First of all, the magnitude of the drop, but then where it's coming from, and that's worthy of comment. I'll kind of telescope back a little bit and say, I was trying to think of an instance in which a majority party had impeached one of their own. Now, I'm confident it's happened somewhere in a judicial case, in some instance in American history. But boy, it's rare. And as students and kind of followers of public opinion, it's fascinating to us because, one of the main theories we have, or kind of controversial theories in public opinion, is sort of whether public opinion is elite driven. That is it the case that people out there, voters generally, simply are paying attention to cues provided by partisans about how they should respond to political events? And one of the things that's been very reliable recently in American politics is an event occurs, Republican elites go one way, Democrats go the other, and their followers pick up on those cues.
It's easy for the voters.
It's easy, yeah,
for partisans.
And we don't have many instances in which there's a split within the party over something like this. And as someone who observes politics, it's fascinating to watch this interesting tango between voters and elites, where our expectation is if Republicans came out sort of forcefully against Paxton, if the Republican leadership generally did, that Republicans would respond. That's our theory. But it's not clear Republican leaders trust the public to follow them on these issues. So our theory predicts that they would be really important. But you could see the reticence of Republicans to take positions like this because they're concerned they're going to get too far out in front of public opinion, or that other Republican leaders won't join them and you'll get a split. The stuff we see here with Paxton, honestly, guys, at the state level is exactly the kind of thing we're looking at the national level with Trump. That is, who's going to be the first or the credible Republican leaders that sort of, and you've seen it at the national level a little bit, but that split, and do Republicans split, or are Republicans so attached to some of these very MAGA or conservative Republican figures that their support stands even in the absence of
there's so much to untangle there.
There's
just so many interesting things going on with that.
Right.
But what I've been thinking about a lot in watching this, and you get the typical reporter questions like, well, were you surprised by this? And I'm like, well, honestly, I don't know. I mean, the fact, but Josh and I were talking when we first looked at this data. I wasn't terribly surprised because I think, this is actually a good case for elite-driven public opinion, but since the elites are split, you know, it's not helpful. And now, in terms of that circuit of elites and public opinion, if you're an elite right now and you're trying to figure out what to do about the Paxton situation, this is incredibly unhelpful.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
exactly
Because you look at Josh mentioned support down, but it hasn't collapsed. And, I'm looking at the strongly approved. It went from 17 to 12, concerning if you're Paxton, but not. And that movement didn't really go much to somewhat approve. Somewhat approved was 22 last time. It's 18 this time. So these numbers have sort of moved a few points across the board. And if we're talking about some kind of standoff where Republican elites are frozen because they don't want to get too far out in public opinion, I agree. I'm not sure how helpful this is in helping you make a decision.
Well,
right?
It's helpful in kind of, I think if you're a Republican, especially, let's just say it, if you're a Republican senator that's going to be part of the jury, part of the quote unquote jury, and I'm, reminding myself to keep doing that because, I think it's a little unhelpful to pursue the judicial comparison too far in this. But, and you're looking for just political guidance. And I don't want to be, I'm trying to be careful to not be overly cynical about this. But it does, if you're kind of going, okay, well, I wonder what Republican constituents look like. And you go, well, even split on the impeachment was justified or it was not justified, and then 39% keeping their powder dry, it doesn't give you clear guidance. And I'm being careful to say, if, in political terms, and again, senators are all taking, swearing oaths to be,
But I mean, I think, to bring two things you guys are saying together, I think, the comparison with Trump and his impeachments is a good one. And it also points out why this is not a quote-unquote trial in the way we think about a judicial process. Because ultimately, everybody who's involved in this trial is an interested party.
Yeah.
And when we looked at, polling around views of Trump's impeachment and those issues, they looked entirely polarized along party lines in exactly the ways we would expect. And so if you were, a Republican senator in the U.S. Senate sitting there in that trial, the one thing you know for certain is where your voters are. And they were not with a vote for a vote of conviction, right? You could just see that easily.
Not getting that cue here.
No, and you're not getting that cue here. Now, what I think is interesting, I want to go back to that 39% because I think it's actually incredibly important, right? So right now you'd say you've got, 60% of the Republican electorate is essentially split 50-50 on the Paxton impeachment. Now, one important point that you found in the data, which I think is really key, is when you look at the extreme conservatives, people who describe their conservatism as extremely conservative, they are much more likely to say that the impeachment was unjustified.
Right.
And that is what we think of. We talk about this a lot in here about, sort of the Republican primary electorate and the effect of sort of the really conservative, engaged voters. And they generally tend to get a little bit, they get more weight on their views. So that's sort of sitting out there if you're looking for guidance, right?
Well, yeah.
But then the flip side of this, too, that I think is really important is that 39%, that is what is up for grabs here, right? Now, one of the things important about the Senate getting those rules out is that until they do, there's essentially no Republicans want to go and touch this to get too close to it because ultimately they don't know where to go. So it's not like there's someone out there waving their flag as sort of the pro, Ken Paxton impeachment guy, right, in the Republican caucus because what do you do, right?
At least that we know of, right?
Not publicly.
Right.
Oh, this is about this elite voter thing.
Yeah.
On the other side, you have allies of Ken Paxton, and I think if Ken Paxton could do it, he would do it himself, who have been very clear about saying, basically, this is all malarkey. Like, this shouldn't be going on. The process was messed up.
Makes it sound like Joe Biden's an ally.
You like that? but just to be clear, it's the Republican Party of Texas. It's Matt Rinaldi. It's those people, and it's allies of Ken Paxton. What's interesting is that all the other people who are in the position of actually knowing something and potentially being on the side of, again, within the Republican caucus of impeaching Paxton are essentially duty bound to not say anything. So what I'm watching now going forward is what happens with that 39%, because there's an asymmetry here in the sense that the people who would prosecute the case are not allowed to talk about it. And technically, I think his defenders have been pretty active and open and trying to go out and send those emails. During the impeachment hearing, there was talk about, Trump has just said this and Ted Cruz has just sent an email saying this. And so they're trying to mobilize, I think, especially, among Paxton defenders, that 39% to his side of this issue. But like as we're saying with public opinion, people watching this, but that's what I'm watching.
Yeah.
What happens to that 39%? Because that, I think, is going to tell us at the very least, not what the senators are going to do, not how they're going to vote, but it's going to tell you what kind of response they are getting out there and what they're expecting to get.
Right, what they're seeing out there in the context. And we don't want to spend we could easily spend the whole podcast talking about this, but there is an interesting. This conversation is such an interesting illustration of one of the classic things about, elements of impeachment that always come up at the federal and now at the state level. And that is the inherently political nature of something we're calling a trial of an elected official by a bunch of other elected officials. Yeah. You're not going to get away from the politics here, no matter how many vows of impartiality everybody takes.
Well, and you've
not the nature of the process,
right? You have familial relations even that complicate things, and that frankly, just to take that particular example, in a trial setting, in a classic judicial setting in the United States, would clearly be conflict of interest and would require recusal. It's not entirely clear to me what the standards are for recusal in this sort of circumstance, because you're denying. Just playing this out, you're denying your representatives an opportunity to opine or to be part of this process. It's a complicated, there's no replacement.
They split the baby. I don't know if you were traveling, they basically split the baby in terms of saying, no, you're a spouse, you can't have a vote, but we know that the Constitution requires that you be here, so you're here and you're part of the denominator of the electoral body, which is ultimately, helpful to the Attorney General or the suspended Attorney General.
It depends on the relationship at the moment, but yes.
This is the point here. I thought you were going to go somewhere else with that. Actually, say yes, a spouse can't vote in this trial, but will make it part of the denominator. However, if one of the other senators / jurors needs to be called to testify, we're going to say that they can testify and then go back to being a juror. So your point is sort of, what is the level of standards? I'll tell you whatever they say they are.
Well, that's and
whatever they've agreed to.
I'm sure most of our audience is aware, the classic Gerald Ford line initially when asked in the 70s about what is meant, what constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors. I believe it was Ford's line was whatever a majority in the House says it is. And that's not you can interpret it as being cynical, but it's not. As a practical matter, that's right. Now, that's for the articles of impeachment, the standards by which you remove somebody from office. But it's amazing how often impeachment has come up lately. I go back to some of the questions involved in impeaching and removing from office somebody who's left office, which of course was the last Trump impeachment. It's kind of fascinating. When this broke, I had to go in and look at my Texas Constitution to figure out exactly how similar or different this was from the federal.
You and everyone else, brother.
Yeah.
So on that, we will almost certainly have another opportunity to talk about this. So another current event, sort of element of the hook, or of the poll results, and something that really, places some of the results in the poll hitting close to home, is that, we had some number of questions in this poll that assessed legislative action and expectations on improving the reliability of the electric grid. And this comes as today is actually not quite as bad. It's only hot rather than excruciating outside. And, everybody, sorry, we're talking about the weather, but, ERCOT issued its first energy conservation warning of the summer in response to excessive heat this week, reminding people to turn down thermostats and things like this. Well, this is something that was standard practice prior to Winter Storm Uri that now has all these overtones and has become something of a trigger for the anxieties that came out of among some people after the storm hit and the massive outages and fatalities in 2021. And we asked about this because it's not news to elected officials, statewide certainly, or in the legislature, that sensitivities on this issue are higher now than they used to be, right? And so, we asked a few questions assessing what the legislature did, and they did a lot. We've talked on the podcast, Josh and I, over the course of the session and even back in the election, during the election year, about just how much activity and stakeholder fighting and attention went into legislation on the grid this time. So we asked people, what they thought.
Yeah, I mean, and just to make a quick point here, in the polling that we did earlier in the session when we asked voters, what they were concerned about, what the legislature had to deal with, the grid remained really high. And I think the main thing that, just to repeat, that we mentioned when we did those results was that, it's bipartisan. And I think that's important here because I think, just to re-highlight this, the idea that because Winter Storm Uri and the state's response to it were mobilized during the last election cycle by Democrats, that it was somehow a partisan issue is just not borne out in the data. I mean, people are just concerned about this. So when we asked, do you approve or disapprove of how the state leaders in the legislature have handled a range of issues, including the reliability of the electric grid, 44% said they disapproved of how state leaders handled this. Only 28% they said they approved. Which is near the bottom in terms of the 16 issue areas. It's not the very bottom, but it's close. We asked another set of questions about confidence in legislative efforts to sort of fix these big problems that voters had raised, also that legislative leaders had raised. Only 18% of voters, so fewer than 1 in 5, said that they were either very or extremely confident that the actions taken by the legislatures would actually increase the reliability of the state's electric grid. A larger share, 47%, so almost half, were either not very confident or not confident. And I think really speaking to where this gets, pricey, and I mean this politically, not to do it this way, not to pun here.
I thought you were referring to Q20.
When we asked,
if you're following along,
you're following
along with your top line document at home.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the things that sort of the politics of this that sort of has been floating around out there since it happened, and I think the lieutenant governor really pushed in on this, was like, well, who's going to pay for this? Are basically our customer, are the ratepayers going to be responsible for all this? And, in some ways, I think that's where, the raw evaluation kind of comes out of all this. When we asked people, we said, okay, the legislature has been working to improve the reliability of the grid. What impact do you think this is going to have on prices? And the plurality, almost half, 48% said they expected higher electricity prices in the future. 17% expected no impact. 16% thought that these efforts might result in lower prices for consumers. And I think the most important thing about all this, in some ways, partisanship didn't matter. A lot of times we can look at these sort of things, especially evaluations of the legislature, and we expect, a certain amount of just sort of, Democrats to be negative, Republicans to be positive. But when we look at this sort of suite of results, it's not as though there's a bunch of Republicans saying, boy, the legislature did a great job here.
I was laughing at the expression on your face, Daron, but, I choose to take this as heartening that, there are limits to partisan polarization, in terms of common sense.
I was laughing at the 16% who thought the legislation would lead to lower prices, but I'm not quite
sure. We know where you are.
I'm not quite sure if they understood the question.
That's very funny.
Well, it's, it's an example. This is emblematic of a particular kind of question, I think, or a particular kind of issue out there where, in some ways, it's a performance issue, and there is skepticism across the board. Even liberal Democrats who think government effort is required and government needs to have an efficacious response to problems. Even versus Republicans who are a little more skeptical about that. Across the board, there's a sense that government is not getting it done. And what you have in the grid issue, first of all, I do think, I've typically kind of mouthed the party line in academia about, well, voters don't really know very much about politics. They're not thinking, and that's true. They've got other things they're concerned about besides politics. But one of the things they're concerned about is, the reliability of electricity in their homes. Mm-hmm. And so while, generally speaking, people don't have well thought out opinions on this thing, I think one of the things I found fascinating was, to Josh's point about the persistence of the salience of the issue, that most Texans, when the grid fails in the winter, think, oh my gosh, what's going to happen in the summer?
Yeah.
Right? And, it doesn't require a ton of – this is something that Texans –
You have to be a policy expert to know that if the power goes out in the summer, you're screwed.
Right. And I think Texans know that, and I think that wasn't a connection that needed to be made by elites for them to think this is an important issue. I think we all thought that, right? Oh, my gosh, what happens when it gets to be 100 degrees? Democrats, I think, because Republicans own everything, are quite – first of all, the – objective appraisal of the handling of the storm, the winter storm, is pretty negative. And I think Democrats are even more likely to embrace that because of Republican leadership, right? Republicans are skeptical of government generally. So even though their guys are in charge, they're like, well, this is another example of government getting it wrong. So there is a unity here, is judgment. It's not a partisan issue, and I think part of it is performance, which is everybody sort of thinks the performance has been suboptimal. But there's a lot of other things going into it. Democratic, kind of antipathy towards Republican leadership, Republican antipathy towards government responsiveness. All that stuff blews in here. And so it's a great question if you want skeptical, pessimistic responses. And all that comes together in some of the top lines that Josh mentioned.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with that partially. I think it might be a little bit, I think you probably intend to attend this. So I'll say that. I think it's a little bit dismissive of the thrust of the result in a sense, in that it's sort of like, well, it's not about this, it's about these other things. And I don't disagree. I think it is about the other things. And I think the main point there that I take is that you can be a Democrat and a Republican, arrive at the same place doesn't mean you got there the same way. And that's always the case with these sorts of things, right?
Well, that's what I meant by saying it's a performance issue, but the underlying...
Yeah, no, that's why I'm agreeing with you on that. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Having said that, I think, one of the things about, this poll and kind of what we're doing is, we're studying contemporary politics here, and one of the things is that, contemporary politics in a lot of ways is about, okay, what did you say you were going to do? Did you do it? Did you do it well? And then I get to vote again. And with the grid, one of the things that's sort of striking about this is that, it may just be the case that there's nothing that they could do that's going to lead to a significant share of the public. To your point, I think this is probably true. I don't think we could ask this question at any point in time where we're going to get 70% of people saying they're extremely or very confident. It's just not in the cards with the way that, attitudes exist towards government generally right now, and just overall skepticism and all the things that you lay out. Having said that, it doesn't change the fact that a result like this tells you why this issue is not going away. Because people are still concerned about it, and because they don't, and the legislature hasn't been able to do enough to say, yeah, and look, this could change. This could be part of what the campaign's about. This could be part of, we get through a summer, who knows? But they haven't done a job of selling and saying, no, but look what we did. It's definitely safer.
Well, I think, look, there's an interesting political question here, and we've been a little reluctant, I think, on the podcast to talk about the politics of it because of the human dimension of the grid failure. And as we move a little bit further away from that, we can start talking about the politics. And the politics are interesting because for the Democrats, this is why it's a tough issue to talk about. It's a good issue politically, naked, crass, partisan politics.
Yeah, look,
terms.
it was, at the start, it was the kickoff issue for the O'Rourke campaign.
Right.
In the
and
last
the only issue for the Collier campaign.
Right.
I'm joking. I'm sorry, but you know what I mean.
I do.
Keep the damn lights on.
And on the Republican side, it's obviously a very difficult issue because you're the party that owns all these positions and majorities in the legislature, and to say that it's the fault of the big energy companies. Yeah. Right. And to try to play sort of a populist angle on it is maybe politically astute, right? Distance myself in case there's another grid failure because I don't want to own, the electrical grid as an issue, right? Where my political future is dependent on how well I kind of get that up and running or keep that up and running. On the other hand, there's a bit of impotence if you simply say, well, I know I own the governorship and the state house and the Senate, but I can't really do anything about that stuff. That's just
too big, too complicated.
Yeah, too big, too complicated. Right. So what do? You can ignore the issue and hope it's sort of low level salience, Josh, not immediately salient in election context. You can try to get out in front by just blaming somebody, but then you raise this other issue. I guess there's another way even, which is you take bolder kind of legislative steps to really target the companies.
Well, on that, I think what's interesting about that is that, certainly in the electoral environment in 2022, it played out much in the way that you're describing. But in the legislative process where, frankly, Democrats didn't really have much to say about the outcome, you saw some elements of what you're talking about, but it was really a conflict between the lieutenant governor and the governor. And, it was the lieutenant governor, frankly, who stood up very early on and saying, essentially, look, the ratepayers are getting screwed here, and we've got to do something about this. And all of a sudden you had Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and it shouldn't be all of a sudden because this is not unprecedented, but being, sort of given credit for taking what was kind of a populist, quote unquote, position with the underlying kind of political conflict being that, he was really putting the governor on the spot, because the underlying narrative here was that everybody that was in charge of this in terms of ownership in that policymaking environment, thinking about Republican primary politics, were all gubernatorial appointees, right? And so the politics have played out in a number of different ways. And, the populist part kind of disappeared a little bit, frankly, in this last session, where they did a lot on this, put a lot of money into resilience and, the drinking game word now, dispatchable energy, and all of this. But that was really like a fight among stakeholders. I mean, you were talking about the Democrats taking this populist position, saying, well, it's the big corporations. Well, this was, I don't know what the right percentage would be, but in the last session, I feel pretty safe saying this is about 90% a competing corporate sector and the energy sector fight, right? And so it turns a lot of interesting ways, and that's another kind of interesting context for this question, in which you've got the institutional politics happening on a very different plane, and whatever the tendencies of this question, voters are just thinking about it in a completely different way. Most voters are not going, well, should we? What's the right energy mix? And we almost asked a question about that and kind of killed it in the process.
Well, it's so interesting here you say that, in the sense that, it's like Dan Patrick was, in that case and in some other cases was sort of taking the populist, position on that. And yet when that, when this session's, negotiation over the that bill kind of got to the end, it was the House who was like, well, should we put a cap on the amount of money we're going to give to the energy companies?
Right.
And that's why, again, none of this stuff is fixed, right? I mean, it's all kind of.
And this may well, piss off some people that were in the process, and pardon me, but there wasn't a lot of discussion about. I mean, it was almost assumed that whatever they were going to do, the ratepayers we're not going to benefit, right? So, and look, the public got that. It looks like. Right. So, in addition to big news related to the impeachment trial and the grid, number of other results, and we'll move some of these a little bit, more quickly, but, we obviously, and it's already come up a little bit, we can't really talk about this at this point without talking about what we got on property taxes. Property taxes are, I've described it so many different ways, but I mean, if you're a Republican lawmaker right now, the property tax reduction situation is pretty embarrassing. I mean, I don't think there's any other way of putting that, in the sense that this was one of the preeminent campaign issues in the campaign, in the 2022 campaign, from governor down, practically to dog catcher. And the intra-party conflicts and the personality conflicts could not be resolved during the regular session. And the conflict has actually gotten even more complicated in the special session, and we've covered it in here. Everybody kind of knows what's happened there. And I think that is I think it's a pretty plausible argument to say that the friction on that and the difficulty of that showed up in the poll numbers this time.
Yeah, well, I've just talked about 16 items we tested. 16th out of 16 is not good.
Yeah.
So I didn't mean to step by Josh. What were the,
No, absolutely.
You want to give the particulars on that?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, I'll just, so, again, we asked the voters to evaluate the legislature and state leaders' job approval in 16 different issue areas. Tied for lowest overall approval was their handling of property taxes, no doubt informed by, what you've been talking about, Jim. The plurality of Texans, 42%, said they expected that their the property taxes that Texans pay to increase. Only 23% think they're going to decrease looking ahead. 21% expect them to stay about the same. And, again, this is another one of those areas that I think, again, if you're a Republican official, you got to be looking at the thing and because it's not just Democrats, right? So 48% of Democrats and 41% of Republicans expect property tax bills to increase. And so, again, and part of this is the way we think about these questions. I mean, look, there's a party that say, yeah, everybody expects their property tax to go up. So that's like the default position. But in a session, he said, on the heels of a campaign, when the legislature comes into session with a historic budget surplus and says, we are going to commit most of that budget surplus to reducing your property taxes, and then they don't do it, people should kind of feel like this isn't going to work.
What happened?
Yeah.
There are there are big global issues we ask about, and people are basically kind of asked to opine on things that they have only indirect or kind of broad experiences with. That's not property taxes, right? Every spring I get my my bill, and I guess the grid is like that too, right? We all interact with the grid, but there's a couple of issues here. We ask about, election and voting laws. There's some personal experience with that. The opioid epidemic, crime, higher ed, these kinds of things.
And we'll get to public education in a second. That's when we've talked in this podcast before about how that is actually pretty distant for a lot of people.
Exactly. But man, when you talk about property taxes, so whatever your feelings about the level of engagement of the Texas public, this is one where, they all have opinions. And as Josh suggested, there's a consensus. They didn't do this right. They get terrible ratings across the board, high expectations that, property taxes are going up. And unlike some of these other issues where there's this sort of complex interaction of sort of outside entities or government entities or corporations that are doing something, and then there's the Republicans and Democrats and stuff. No. Right. They've got control over this, and they,
Well, and I think one of the interesting things about that is that, look, property taxes, we've said in here many times, if you actually look at the mechanisms, it is pretty complicated.
Right. No, agreed.
But the complexity of it is also what made, I think, a lot of us think, well, they might debate how they're going to do this. But as I've said in here, a million times, and we're seeing it in the policy discussion, there's a lot of knobs to turn here. And I think it's fair for, the average person who's not even, very plugged into what those knobs are, what the, difference between compression and homestead exemption or, whatever.
And where the compressing is happening.
But nonetheless, you're kind of, I think as an elected official that's talked about this a lot, you kind of made your own bet if you go up and promise people and give them the impression, as you were saying, Josh, there's a bunch of money. We can do this. We're going to do it. You can count on us to do it. We're running the place. We're going to do it. And then when you don't do it, people are going to be a little stumped about it and a little grumpy.
Yeah, it's a particular problem for Republicans. Yeah. I mean, they've been talking about property taxes since they took over back in '94 or whatever it was, right?
Right.
And I don't know at what point Republican voters or independent voters or even, kind of soft Democrats say, this is like your main issue, and my property taxes have gone up X percent.
Right.
I know it's more complicated, but
you know what? It's not.
The point,
I know.
But that's the thing. The point is,
yeah.
It's complicated, but not impossible to pull off, and you have to own not only the promise, but the tone of the promise that was like, yeah, we're doing this.
Yeah. Right. Don't worry.
Yeah. Right.
Well, and I want to make one point on this because I think it's important. I think it's easy to look at a result like this and say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, given everything we're describing here, why wouldn't you see negative responses? If you've heard anything about the legislature and property taxes, it would be about the fact that they are at this impasse. They haven't done what they said they're going to do, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to point out, after the last legislative session, when property taxes were not a driving force issue during the majority of what they were doing, and we asked a similar battery of evaluations in the summer, property taxes came back at the bottom that time as well in terms of approval, right? Now, the funny thing is, I'm saying we did not do this. But pretty soon after those results came out, and that was sitting there at the bottom, that was when they did the homestead exemption kind of at the very last minute, at the very end of that special session, right? They sort of rammed that one through because, of course, the voters are going to approve an increase in the homestead exemption. They did, right? But what that tells me in some ways, this result is somewhat a reflection of the current moment, but also we can go back 2 years and people were It's
cumulative.
It is cumulative,
yeah.
Exactly.
I agree. Yeah, I think that's right.
So, we've got a couple things in here that we'll come back to. We'll figure out a way to get some of this in. But as we go on here, I do want to ask each of you guys, what's the zeitgeist takeaway from this poll that you get? We talk about underlying themes, the kind of assessment of the mood.
Well, we were having a kind of informal conversation before we began here today, and I'll just point out that my zeitgeist interpretation is pretty pessimistic here right now. And just two kind of data points. I believe Josh is the source of this, so it's a great question, and I can say that because I had nothing to do with it. But I've always liked this question. Here's a pair of opposite phrases which better describes. We asked about state government, about local government. And we ask, mostly honest or mostly dishonest. And then we ask, mostly careful with tax dollars, mostly careless. mostly address the needs of residents, mostly, ignore the needs. And those numbers are really, really going down over time. It's at the state level. And, you see a little bit of it at the, also at the local level, but not nearly as much. So that's part of it. And then the second part I'd point to, and this is a little bit of a bank shot on this kind of pessimism or zeitgeist, is, of the questions, we asked about performance or the support for proposals that the Texas Legislature considered this year. And amongst the highest testing proposals were anything basically involved with kind of law and order. And across a range. I mean, obviously there was support for limiting firearm access in sort of appropriate ways to whether it's to young people or people who have records or things like that. But it was also, things about sentencing, punishing people who are in violation of election laws. And you put all that together, and the listeners can take a look at those items and argue with me about packaging some of them together. Yeah. But I just get this sense that there's this real desire for order and normalcy out there, and I think it's partly reflective of post-COVID environment, partly reflective of just the disruptions that people have felt, and the sense that things are just kind of out of control. And I was struck by the sentiment for that, the very, very strong, and I'm talking about sort of 70% to 80% support for those sorts of measures. And so I pair those things together, this sort of general, God, I don't want to go Jimmy Carter on everybody, but malaise with respect to the performance.
You heard it here first.
Yeah,
well,
I'm a one-termer. What can I say?
Let's see. I think when you're talking about that, I think more about like the general disorder. The things that kind of pop up in my mind is talking about is like, the street takeovers. Earlier in the year, there were, these sort of like flash mobs, going into stores and stealing, stuff. And then and the idea that like this is just becoming a more common part of life, along with mass shootings and all these other things. Yeah. It does speak to this idea that there is I think, an important point here. There's a large desire, and it's not just Republicans who are looking for law and order. I think it's a lot of voters and a lot of just people are saying, yeah, we could be a little bit more in control over this stuff.
Yeah, look, that's even, you could argue that that's even a little piece of the grid thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah. Well, I think, spelling it out in macro, it's part of Biden's appeal. Not so much but normalcy.
No, that was his.
Let's return
not being on the news every day.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
I think it's all of those things are kind of, I think, derivative of this general sense that people have in this particular environment, this point in time.
How about you, Josh?
I was really intrigued by the way that this poll really kind of cut through some of the political geography in some interesting ways. Some of the stuff you were speaking to speaks to this, but I'll just be specific, I guess. When we look at, views about the grid, when we look at views on property taxes, we don't see a lot of difference when we're talking urban, suburban, rural. And normally what we find is basically in some ways the locational variables are like proxies for party, right? When you see the urban results, they tend to be, a lot more Democrats. Rural is overwhelmingly Republican, and so the views generally tend to reflect that. And, and suburbia is really where there's competition in the state. And we talked about this on the podcast a lot about the different electoral results and what they look like and why Texas suburbs are, in a lot of ways, the mobilizing force behind a lot of contemporary politics. And in general, I think majority party has been able to pick a lot of issues that really, play well in the suburbs politically. And I think, if you look at the issue battery, compared to these general evaluations, overwhelmingly positive results in most cases to most of the specific policies that we tested, including, I think, a lot of policies that are meant to mobilize conservative parents, conservative suburbanites, which is where the competition is. But when you look at this poll and you look at, again, views of future property taxes, again, regardless of whether you live in, Austin, Fort Worth, out in Fort Bend or wherever, right, Jordanton, they're negative, right? The grid. Negative. And to your point on these questions about, views generally of state and local government, the drop in positive evaluations towards state government is really remarkable in and of itself. It's especially remarkable in Texas's suburbs right now. And that's something I think, got to keep an eye on going forward in terms of, how does what happens this legislative session, whenever it ends, how does that get packaged and mobilized into a story that gets told, and how does it play, again, especially in the suburbs? Because right now it's not looking great.
Right. I think, I think there's a consensus on what the overarching thing going on here is this, this kind of churn in attitudes towards institutions and particularly state government. But I think what really is sticking out to me as you were talking, Daron, it actually helped crystallize it for me, at least one aspect of it a little bit, is that, we're seeing such tension in a lot of the impulses in the state right now. On one hand, you've got this kind of declining, some of it is trust, some of it is responsiveness, some of it is, a sense of efficacy of state government, things we always talk about. But at the same time that is happening, you're also seeing both in public opinion and among elites a kind of a funny reassertion of state government and state government power. So, one of the things that was a big issue in the last session, in the last few sessions, is this notion of state preemption of local government. Public attitudes, if you look closely, I think, at the comparison of those paired responses you were talking about, comparing state and local government, doesn't really show a big weakening in support or views of the nature of local government, even as state government is asserting itself against local government. And then when you throw in your sort of, I think the really well taken point on my part, this sense of, wanting some order, some predictability, normalcy, if you will, and state government, in a sense, sort of saying, we will provide that.
140 days every 2 years.
But, it doesn't seem like it's taking among the public. I don't think that the public is buying it. If anything, it's moving in the opposite direction. And I just wonder what, is that, and it's obviously going to be more than one thing. Is it the general kind of institutional, decay in institutional support we've talking about? Is it difficulty in governance? Is it partisanship? Is it
nationalization of politics?
Nationalization of politics? Is it a long, how much of this is, a long period of one-party rule in the state that may be having an effect both on governance habits, decision-making? As we talk about this fight over property taxes, it's hard for me to believe that if Republicans were really worried about the general election environment, that they would feel so free to just keep fighting with each other over how to deliver the property tax cut.
Yeah. No, it's a fair point. I think Republicans have this sort of ideological problem generally, which is like, hey, we control state government. Well, we're the party of local government or government closer to you and limited government. But the Democrats control a lot of these local governments, and we don't really trust them. And the public wants us to address certain issues, and this is the mechanism by which So there's a really interesting when Republicans own everything lock, stock, and barrel at the state level, and that's the mechanism by which, they have the ability to sort of deal with these problems that they think are problems, but they have these sort of ideological and locational issues with respect to dealing with them that create problems. I don't think the Democrats have quite the same array of problems, right? In California or New York, COVID's a good example, right? COVID hits in California and New York, government lockdowns. Here, do this. This is what you need to do to protect the public safety, public health. In Texas, it's, are we really comfortable with exercising that power at the state level? Are our constituents comfortable with,
Well, and at an instrumental level, because if I'm not worried about the general election, as soon as you get pushback from somebody who jogs to your right, if you're, say, Governor Abbott, you're under, you're feeling direct political pressure to act differently, respond differently.
I talked a lot about this with my California friends about the complexity of Texas' response to COVID, which is just the example we're dealing with now, compared to the California or New York response. And, Republican versus Democrat, the geographic complexity of Texas, the urban versus rural complexity, you think about Abbott's dilemma, which is even if I decide, with a constituency that's suspicious of governmental use of power, well, now I've got, what about what I'm doing in Harris County versus what I'm doing in Deaf Smith? And does that make sense? And I try to convey this to my friends in California. I'm like, it's not an easy.
Wait. They're going, what, Deaf who?
Yeah, exactly. I was just trying to say, I get that California is a complex place geographically. I get that in New York too. But man, in Texas, it's even, I think all of us become kind of empathetic to the problems of governing a state like Texas, even as we observe this stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting the extent to which this, this political phrase, well, we can't have a patchwork of laws, has just kind of become this sort of catch-all, and you say, well, can we? I mean,
Are we sure about that?
Yeah, well, exactly. The flip side of that is how do we not?
Well, that is right, and that is the flip side. That it would be to say, in a state that has not only the very, very different geographies of let's say 5 of the biggest cities in the country, but also a rural population that could be its own state. Maybe you do need a little bit of flexibility, just to move this along, but also it's connected. So I'm going to do it. We're near the end, right, Jim?
Yeah, no.
Okay, you're the MC. So I know that usually what we do at the end is we're going to do our,
I think we kind of folded from the zeitgeist to the interesting idea.
Well, let me
combine them.
Yeah, let me deep cut on that then, just to say, one of the really interesting things I think, and maybe the most interesting thing. I don't know. I have to think about this. To me, in this poll, and it goes back.
Well, if it's the most interesting to you, you don't really have to think about it that much.
That's true. Well, I don't know. I'm deciding whether it's the most interesting to me.
You're a pretty decisive guy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I like to be fair too. So, but we've been talking about these questions about basically whether state or local government, people's views of whether they're honest or dishonest, whether they take your people's tax dollars, whether they respond to citizens. And one of the most interesting things in this survey was the extent to which I would say this going into it. Given the politics, given the Death Star bill, the preemption bill that the legislature passed, it really takes away a lot of powers of local governments. Efforts to restrain the budgets and the revenue generating abilities of local governments over previous cycles. Efforts to remove locally elected district attorneys, so on and so forth, and then a bunch of stuff that didn't pass. Right? The expectation would be, well, surely Republicans have a pretty negative view of their local governments, and ultimately that's not what this poll finds. And that was actually one of the most interesting things. I mean, when I was looking for where is this antipathy to local government that is underlying this, and the answer is it's not coming from the electorate.
Right.
And part of that is because, to your point, you were kind of bringing this up with respect to COVID. People sort themselves largely, there's a lot of political sorting that goes along geographic lines. And the thing is, if you're a Republican in the state, there's a good chance that you lived in a community that maybe was a little bit more light-handed in its COVID response. If you're some of the most liberal, leaning Democratic voters in the state, there's a good chance that you lived in a community that was maybe a little bit more interested in addressing that. Now, that was COVID until basically the state came in and said, no, we're going to do this. And then views split, basically polarized along partisan lines. I think you're seeing something similar here that's really interesting. But again, the most interesting thing in this poll is I don't see in the electorate where this antipathy to local government is coming from. Because ultimately, who elects the local government? Local voters, which has always been what the argument has been. And so I think that's something we're going to have to watch going forward. We've definitely taken some missteps around this issue of local control in terms of trying to figure out how to sort of touch on this and think about it. But it is really remarkable, again, looking at the comparative evaluation, that even amidst sort of these declines in overall evaluations of institutions, of governments and whatever, one thing seems to remain, which is but local government's better.
Yeah.
According to most voters.
As we close out, I think one of the things that's really interesting about that going forward is, as you kind of suggest in that, how elusive these issues actually are when it comes to us trying to really probe public opinion about it. We've talked about how, the idea of local control and, the valorization of local government, it seems to have, as you're suggesting, Josh, and it's an interesting combination of the way that we've talked about it in the past. In some ways, the experiential part of that is kind of easy to see in the way that you're talking about with geographic sorting. On the other hand, when you put it in words and you put it in front of people, the roots of trying to put a label on that cognitively are very shallow.
Well, yeah. And I just one other sort of summative thing about this, because it's interesting because there's something going on here that I don't know how it plays out, right? Which is that, when we look at responses to sort of the types of policies that people might hear about that kind of will peek through, all the noise during a legislative session, what you tend to find is that, unsurprisingly, these issues are popular. Why do I say unsurprisingly? Because politicians have pollsters too. Yeah. Right? They have a pretty good sense about what their view of the zeitgeist is also informed by data, just like this, And so it's not surprising to see that among the set of policies that they produced, there's a fair amount of, again, positive response to that. The flip side of that is when we ask all these general evaluations, it's so overwhelmingly negative.
Right.
And so I guess just from a basic kind of mechanics of politics standpoint, is that good enough? Or is there a point at which, the one starts to outweigh the other where you say, oh, well, Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that the legislature, addressed, let's say, sexually explicit materials in public schools, even though I don't have a kid in public school because most voters don't. But on the other hand, my electricity might go off and my taxes are going up and also the city's getting more crowded and the roads aren't really keeping up. I mean,
if you ask me about the public education system generally.
Yeah, that's the thing. All the general evaluations are very negative. And I think the other sort of really important thing in this poll that, I mean, just, if I was an elected official in the majority party right now, I'd be noticing is that, it's not all Democrats. There's a significant share of Republicans who are also holding these negative performance, evaluations over these big issues. And the question is, and I mean, not to be dismissive, but is there enough candy that you can give Republican primary voters that this doesn't matter? And that's kind of what's sort of sitting out there, looking at the end of where we are at least in this session.
Yeah, and that and that is a good explanation of that. The kind of difference between the positive range of those specific policy evaluations and the much less enthusiastic evaluations almost everywhere else. We'll just use the word endogenous and call it a day. So thanks to both of you guys for being here, and of course for the great work on the poll. Thanks very much, as always, to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. All of these polling results can be found at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You can also sign up for our email list there. You'll find the podcast there with lots of supplemental material. So thank you. Thanks to Josh.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Daron.
My pleasure as always.
Thanks again to our excellent and vital production team in the studio here. And especially thanks to you for listening. And we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.